Hello, my name is Robbie Ventura, and I will be your host of the Velocity Cycling Podcast. We have an incredible show for you today. We're going to pit two of the greatest runners of all time against each other in a discipline that they're not really an expert at, the 800 meter. Who are we going to choose? None other than Usain Bolt, the fastest man alive, and of course, the greatest endurance distance runner ever, Eliud Kipchoge, the only person to run under 2 hours for a marathon. Now, that 800 distance is an interesting one. It requires both the energy systems of the glycolytic or the anaerobic side that Usain Bolt is the master of, as well as the endurance or the aerobic side of which Eliud Kipchoge is the master of. I'm not going to figure this out on my own. I'm going to bring in two incredible experts. One, Dr. Phil Skiba, who has worked with Nike on the Breaking2 project and has worked with Eliud Kipchoge in some of his training. And of course, I'm going to bring in Sebastian Weber, who really understands exercise physiology as well as the metabolic energy systems pretty much as good as anybody else. He's worked with professional cycling teams on the Pro Tour as well as professional and world champion triathletes. Together, we're going to try to answer the question, A, who's going to win the race when they're both at their peak? Usain, the best sprinter, and Kipchoge is the best marathon runner. Then we're going to model out if they trained for a year and both of them focused 100% on the 800, would the results be any different? Without any further ado, we're going to start with Dr. Phil Skiba and the question, who will win the 800, Usain Bolt or Eliud Kipchoge? Hello, my name is Robbie Ventura, and I am your host here at the Velocity Cycling Podcast, where our one goal is to get you to fast faster. There is no one way to have great cycling performance. What works for some of us may not work for others. We really want to expose you to some of the greatest minds in sports performance, and hopefully we can try to figure out what works best for you to meet your goals and to meet your genetic potential. We're going to do one job and we're going to try to do it the best we can, and that is get you to fast faster. Hello and welcome to the Velocity Cycling Podcast. My name is Robbie Ventura and I will be your host, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to ask a pretty cool question. Who is the greatest runner on the planet? Well, we know the fastest runner on the planet is Usain Bolt, who's got the world record. We know the greatest marathoner on the planet is Eliud Kipchoge, but what if they raced an 800-meter all-out track race? Who would win that? Would it be the sprinter or would it be the marathoner? Well, I'm not going to answer this question by myself. I'm bringing in a great friend of mine and an incredible sports scientist, Dr. Phil Skiba, who had the opportunity to work with Kipchoge, which is going to be great insight, on the Breaking2 project with Nike back in 2017, where they came within a whisker of breaking that incredible 2-hour barrier. Dr. Phil Skiba, thank you for being with us. I always love talking to you and hearing your insight. You continue to teach me and educate me on a regular basis, and I'm really excited about this topic. How about you?
Yeah, it's good to see you, buddy.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit, give us some insight into Kipchoge. We all know what an incredible specimen he is. Talk about his personality and some of those elements that really make him such an incredible competitor, not only a physical specimen, but also a great competitor.
Yeah, I mean, Eliud's an incredibly nice and genuine guy, the first time I met him, we were at Nike HQ and we were talking about this trip to Africa that we were going to take, to film the movie and to work with them, hands-on in Africa and see what it was like on a day-to-day basis. And so, he and I sit down and he says to me, no, this is going to be great. You're going to come to Africa and we're going to train together. And we kind of look at each other for a second and then we both start laughing. And he says, you'll probably ride in the car and I'll train, but you're just a very funny, very genuinely nice guy. But, his outlook is really interesting because it's rare. And this is in general a feature of a lot of the Kenyan athletes I met. They're very humble people. You'll often hear Eliud say things like, 100% of me is not even worth, 1% of the team. Because when you see these guys out there training together, they're supportive of each other. They're constantly egging each other on. It's a uniquely positive work environment. These guys live out in their camp in the middle of nowhere in rural Kenya, running on these roads that, are just potholes and mud and just, totally unimproved. And they're all guys that kind of take that to heart and really push each other, to work through those conditions and do something special.
Yeah, definitely two special athletes for sure. And I don't know much about Usain Bolt as a person, but I will tell you, he seems to have an incredible passion for what he does. He seems to enjoy the process of becoming the fastest man in the world. And both of these guys, they're smiling a lot. I think they're passionate and they love what they do. And I think it's part of the reason why they've had success, not just once, but year after year after year of being on top. And we all understand how difficult it is to get to the top. I think it's a lot tougher to stay at the top. And these two have done that for some time.
Yeah. And, the interesting thing about Usain Bolt is that, we think of athletes training constantly trying to stay on the top. The trick to staying a great sprinter is not training a lot, because training increases your aerobic capacity. And that's not what you want to be as a sprinter. You want to save all that explosive energy and not have it converted over to more endurance-oriented energy. And that's so. Usain Bolt has always joked about how little he trains, but the reason why he's so good is because he trains so little.
Absolutely. We're going to get a little into that when we start talking about the answer to the second question. First question is, in their prime, who wins an 800? And the second question I want to talk about, Doc, is if these two athletes trained for an entire year with the number one focus of doing an 800 meter, would the results be any different? So let's start with the first question. Let's start with some of the key elements from a scientific perspective, from a physiology perspective, from a math perspective, is what you're incredible at. Let's talk about their performances. For starters, Bolt can run at 28 miles an hour, or nearly 28 miles an hour, the world record in a 9.58. I mean, that is absolutely moving, and that requires a certain metabolic contribution. Talk a little bit about the type of metabolic contribution that it takes to run at that speed.
Yeah, so what you want to think about is the muscle itself, right? And when you look at the muscle, what kind of fibers is it made up of? In sprinters, we traditionally think of those guys as having a lot of what are called fast twitch muscle fibers. These are fibers that are very, very strong. They can generate a lot of power for a very, very short period of time before they kind of just fatigue and punk out. And so, they're not surrounded with a lot of blood vessels to give them more oxygen. They don't have a lot of mitochondria to provide them more energy. So what they got is kind of what they got. And that's why we say sprinters are born, not made. Because metabolically speaking, there's very little going on. You've got this pool of creatine that's going to give you your energy, creatine phosphate, and that's what you've got to blow over the next 100 meters or 200 meters or something like that.
I'm just going to bring you up to speed here, folks. We have none other than Sebastian Weber from Inside joining our discussion on Kipchoge versus Bolt in the 800-meter race. And the nice thing about Sebastian Weber is he's been on the show before. He brings a nice understanding of the metabolic component. I've said this before. I continue to learn from Sebastian as well on the contribution and the importance of the metabolic engine as it relates to trying to figure out how to take performance to the next level. And Sebastian, we were just talking about the contribution of energy for a sprinter and how 95% of that energy for Usain Bolt, or maybe even more than that, comes from the glycolytic and the creatine phosphate energy system. You want to expand at all on that in terms of like some of the sprinters that you've worked from and how you can kind of figure that out? How do you measure where the energy is coming from?
Well, in general, measuring creatine phosphate is something really difficult. Measuring the glycolytic component in terms of VLA max, has been evolving in the sport in the past years. That's kind of established, but maybe not established, but there are some good concepts how to do that. Creatine phosphate is more difficult, and there are also two aspects to it. One is the maximum, power that an athlete is able to produce, which would, refer to the maximum speed at which you can break down creatine phosphate. And the limiting factor here is not how long it takes to take energy out of creatine phosphate, the limiting factors here are more like neuromuscular and force production and those kind of things. But the other thing about creatine phosphate that it's important to understand that it's like a bucket of energy, and when it's empty, it's kind of empty. Like you have to stop. You have to rest, or you have to decrease your intensity in order for the aerobic system to restore it. So one very important piece here when it comes to 100-meter running is being able to understand how big is that bucket. Because theoretically, if the athlete would only run on creatine phosphate, he would last maybe 60 meters or maybe 70 meters or something, right? But he would not last for the whole race. So this already gives us an idea about the issue or the fact that the bigger the creatine phosphate store, the better for the 100-meter run, because you last longer into the race on creatine phosphate.
Okay, so we got the understanding of the energy and where it comes from for a 100-meter dash. Now let's talk about a marathon, the other end of the spectrum, right? So we understand what's fueling Bolt and where his energy is coming from. Where is the energy coming from on the Kipchoge side?
It's entirely aerobic in nature. When you look at the great marathon runners, and actually, there's an open access paper that we published from Breaking2 that we profile. We can't say exactly who is who, but we profile all the athletes that we tested in preparation for Breaking2, and we look at their different physiological characteristics. And so what's interesting about that is that you need three things, right? And in general, we call it the 80-80-180 rule. Okay, that you have to have a VO2 max of about 80 or 85. You need to have your lactate threshold occur at about 80 to 85% of that VO2 max, and you need a running economy of about 180 mils, and that combination gets you to the marathon in about 2 hours. And so that's been established since the early 1990s. Mike Joyner published the first modeling paper on that, and that's how we selected people for the task, was who's got the engine for this and who's economical enough to be able to handle that for 2 hours.
So just to paraphrase that in some, I mean, I love the fact that we have such an incredible amount of science and physiology going on here. But just to break that down, the energy comes from the aerobic system, not the anaerobic system primarily. I mean, there is some contribution from the anaerobic system, of course, at times, but for the most part, it's the slow twitch muscle fiber. It's the fat burning capacity of these athletes that fuel that the energy comes from for these events that are 2, 3, 4 hours in duration.
Yeah.
Which is the exact opposite, right? Slow twitch fibers versus fast twitch fibers, fat versus, creatine phosphate and carbohydrate.
Yeah, well, the way you want to think about it is that, when you look at human physiology, when you look at the way athletes' bodies actually work, there's different, we call them discontinuities, where there's a big change, right? So when you're running pretty easy, you're using primarily fat for fuel. You're not making a lot of lactate. You're just cruising along. When you go hard enough that you generate a little bit of lactate, the reason why that happens is that you can't meet the energy demand just by burning fat alone. You have to start burning some carbohydrates. And at the same time, you start recruiting more of those slightly faster twitch fibers that aren't as endurance oriented. And that's one of the things you see in these, in these runners, and really any great endurance athlete, is you're looking to find a place where that switchover happens at a higher level, because everyone carries a lot of fat, right? Even skinny people have quite a bit of fat on board. But everyone has a limited amount of carbohydrate on board. The average person has about 20 miles worth of glycogen in their muscles. And that's a problem because the marathon's 26 miles long.
So Sebastian, now we have the 800, right? We know that the marathon is aerobic. We know the sprint is anaerobic. Where does the 800 lie? And who do you, obviously, what contribution, is it more on the glycolytic side or is it more on the aerobic side? Tell us.
So when you look at those three systems, the majority of the energy comes already from the aerobic system. In terms of the majority, it's about 50%. So it's the majority of all those three systems, right? And if you think about it, that, the oxygen uptake takes not so much time to really catch up, right, and really being able to contribute, especially when you talk about on a muscular level, how long it takes for the aerobic system to produce a decent amount of energy. After 40 to 60 seconds, you are close, well, somehow close to the maximum already, within the 90% range. And so, it is approximately 50% aerobic for the 800 meter. And then you're talking about 30 to 35%. Obviously, it depends on, the metabolic profile of the athlete, but you're talking about 30 to 35% from the glycolytic system. And then the remaining part is basically, depleting, more or less, or completely depleting your creatine phosphate system.
So in sum here, we have kind of the middle of the road, right? We're picking the distance where they both these contributions are important, and both of them are good at the opposite. So I think the 800 distance is probably a good competition to understand that they both have gifts on the opposite ends, and now we're choosing kind of the middle of the road here to determine the winner of this race. Let's go to VO2 max just for a second. Talk about the VO2 max importance across these three disciplines. How important is VO2 max in a 100-meter dash?
Very little. That's the interesting thing about VO2 max in general, is that if you look at the big picture, what you'll find is that people with a really low VO2 max are not very good endurance runners. People with a high VO2 max are going to be better endurance runner in general. But if you take a bunch of people with a high VO2 max no longer tells you who the best is. And that's what's so interesting about it. And the reason for that is that it's like a Ferrari, right? A Ferrari doesn't have great fuel economy, right? A great marathon runner or a great guy with a really high VO2 max has got a really big engine, right? But he might not be so economical. And economical becomes important if you got to go for 2 hours.
Yep. So we're going to get to economy in a second. You're jumping ahead of me, Doc. Okay, you're jumping ahead of me. No problem. But I want to talk about, so just from a standpoint of explaining VO2 max, I'll just make it as obvious as possible. It's basically the amount of oxygen that your body can process and use. And it's basically the delta between the amount of oxygen that's coming in versus the oxygen that's coming out. And that difference is the amount of oxygen that your body is using. And when you're at absolute highest level capacity, what is that number, right? Like if you're taking in if you're going as fast as you can for a 2 or 3 minute effort, you're taking in 6,000 milliliters and you're exhaling 2, you're using 4,000 milliliters of oxygen. And that's kind of your capacity of usable oxygen. And you divide that by your weight in kilograms and you get a relative VO2 number. Now, that oxygen is obviously very, very important, as Dr. Skiba said, in longer distance events, not quite as important in the 100-meter dash. Sebastian, how important is it in the 800-meter?
We just said that approximately 50% of the energy comes from the aerobic system. So if you're able to increase your VO2 max, you're increasing the main contributor to this 800 meters. So long story short, it is very important. You cannot run you cannot, compete on the highest level, become world champion or, somewhere in the elite level if your VO2 max is not super high. It's like the VO2 max of an 800-meter runner, is very similar to what Phil just said. It's like the best marathon runner, 80, 85. Maybe a tiny bit lower if you think about maybe an 800 meter is a little bit heavier. There might be a small tendency, splitting hairs, that because it's per kilogram, it's maybe a little bit less because they maybe carry a little bit more muscle than a marathon runner. But yeah, you're talking about the same ballpark. So there's not a significant difference here.
If that's the case, Kipchoge gets an advantage here. So on the contribution side, we'll call it a draw. On the VO2 max side, we know Kipchoge is probably in the 85 range. I know that we don't have the exact number, but it's probably 85 to 90, somewhere in that range. And if you're talking about a guy that's 5'6", 115 pounds and has 85, Bolt is 6'5", 207 pounds. There's no chance his VO2 max is over 65, correct?
Not a chance.
No, most likely not. No.
Most likely not. I'm going to put it at 50.
Up to the chest, maybe. Maybe up to the chest.
You've got another problem too, right? It's not just about the size of the aerobic engine. It's how quick you can crank up the throttle. And one of the things we know about these great Kenyan athletes that we've tested is that when you look at how quickly that ramp comes up, it comes up over a period of 12 seconds or so. All right. That's called the time constant. That's how long does it take to come up to about 66%. And that takes about 12 seconds. So 4 or 5 times that gives you how long you're at full blast with the aerobic system. So by the time we get to a minute, by the time he gets past 400 meters, that system is humming. It is way slower in sprinters. And so that's going to be a real challenge for Bolt, is because he can't ramp up. He's got a smaller engine aerobically, and it's going to take him way longer to crank it up. Okay,
so we got a slight advantage on the VO2 max side for Kipchoge.
A big
advantage. Okay, fine. So we got Kipchoge gets a point on that. Now let's talk about economy. Doc, you were talking a little bit about this and couple minutes ago. Let's talk about the other elements that make great runners, right? We know VO2 max plays a role. We know the contribution of energy plays a role. What about the other components, even from a standpoint of bone length to elasticity, to all these other components, how they regulate heat? Talk about some of the other elements of economy that Kipchoge and Bolt both have in excess, and then which elements might hurt or help them in this 800.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things with respect to economy. There's been a lot of good studies done with things like high-speed cameras, where they say, what are the components that make you more economical or not as a distance runner? And they find interesting things. What they find is that if you look at just globally, if you look at fast runners and like short, middle distance runners and long distance runners, and Jack Daniels of Daniels Running Formula, the famous book, did these studies in the 1980s. And what he found out was that the endurance runners, the marathon runners, et cetera, are more economical than you might expect running marathon distance, but they're not so good at high speed. And you find exactly the difference. The opposite for the middle distance runners or the sprinters is that at higher speeds, they're more economical than you expect, and less so for the other guys. So some part of it is inborn, and some part of it is training. But the other part of it is we want to look at their mechanics and say what's more economical than not. And that's super hard to do because when you look at them on high-speed cameras, the difference between a really economical runner and a non-economical runner is like a degree or two here or there. How straight is their leg when it hits the ground, and where do they actually put it on the ground? And that's hard to do. Now, when you look at someone like Bolt, we do know that in general, longer stride lengths are less economical. But that's the quickest way to increase speed, is by increasing your stride length. Now, for Bolt, that doesn't matter over 100 meters. He's interested in getting there the fastest. He's not interested in being economical. But over 800, he's got a bigger problem on his hands.
So economy obviously gets more important from a standpoint of fuel usage and aerobic contribution when it gets long. But obviously in shorter events, it's...
And when you look at and it's interesting, when you look at economy, say in sprinters, the economy, meaning how much of their speed comes from the elastic rebound of like their Achilles tendon and their ligaments and things, that goes up the faster they go. So as you get up to, approaching your maximum speed, you're getting more and more elastic spring from your step. So they do have that going for them in the shorter events.
Okay. Care to comment on economy, Sebastian?
Well, I think one thing we should take into account here is that when we talk about things like VO2 max, and so we talk about per kilogram body weight. And I think another aspect here is that, the guy's running at somewhere north of 7 meters per second, hopefully. And Bolt creates also more drag. So, like when you talk about energy per kilogram body weight, but it's similar to cycling, but drag comes in, like aerodynamic drag starts to play a role here, and it does a little bit. Then my take on economy is also, you would also need to think a little bit about Bolt is pretty huge compared to Kipchoge.
Yeah, I mean, there was actually good work done on this in the 1970s where they tested this and found that it's not a small amount, it's seconds.
Yes. It's quite significant.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why in Breaking 2, the biggest thing we did I love to talk about that we trained Eliud and the other guys, but the truth is the biggest thing we did for them was put a stack of pacers in front of them to break that took minutes off of the marathon time.
Yeah.
At these speeds, I mean, they're going 13 plus miles an hour. There is definitely drag. And you're right, 800 meters, even faster than that. Obviously, drag plays a big role. And you can even see that with obviously even the clothes are starting to change in track and field because they're understanding the importance of drag.
And by the way, and this has been the case, in the early 2000s, if you remember, like the full body suits for the Australian Games, remember that?
Yeah.
That was all about drag already.
I'm with you. I hear you. And now they're sticking the numbers to their legs.
In Breaking 2, which we didn't make a big thing about, but you can see it for a moment in the movie, we actually made these shark skin sort of, pieces of fabric that we spray glued onto their legs because it helped reduce the drag because the fastest thing moving through the air is their leg on the swing. It's difficult to say how much gain they get you, but yeah, we were thinking about all those things.
Love it. Okay, so we're gonna kind of jump to this next piece, and that is if we're looking at who's going to win this event, we got to take past performances into consideration. You guys have done a great job kind of laying out the physiology requirements and kind of the things to consider when that comes. But now we actually have to look at some of the times that these guys have actually run and outside of their main events. So Kipchoge has ran a 350 mile, which is just nuclear speed. And if you just cut that in half, you got a 155.8, pretty much 800 meter, which is obviously very, very fast. Now, Bolt's recorded 800 meter is only a 210, but a lot of people said that wasn't absolutely all out, and he had done zero endurance training, as Dr. Skiba talked about earlier. So a better number is his 45.28 400 meter, and I think Kipchoge's 400 meter, just from just a little bit of research on his training, right around 60 seconds. So that's a pretty big delta when it comes to from a 400 meter. That's a 15-second lead that Bolt would potentially have on Kipchoge. But again, his best 800 meter is a 210, and Kipchoge's is a 155. So with those two things in mind, kind of where are you guys leaning for now? Again, we're not talking about train. We're talking about when Bolt won the gold medal in the 100 meter. And Kipchoge did his sub 2-hour marathon. If they got on the line right then and raced as hard as they could for 800 meters, knowing what you guys know, what do you think the result would be?
I mean, it's actually, you can answer this question with a little bit of data. So if you look at like Bolt's best 100 through 400 times, right, and you run a model, I come up with 114.5 seconds, right? So 155 in the best sprint shape of his life. We know that Eliud is probably capable of a 155 or faster 800. If you just think about his best marathon performance at 350, and he can pretty regularly bang out 60-second intervals, for 400 on the track. So to me, you're not going to get Eliud too much faster than that. But I'm not sure that you can take a sprinter. Sprinters are born, they're not made, right? They're built with these gifts, with these giant, fast twitch muscle motor units. They can go really fast. The idea that we're going to take, 10, 15 seconds off a Bolt over 800, that's a big lift.
So without any training, you're taking Kipchoge, and with training, you're taking Kipchoge.
Yeah, that's the way I look at it. Sebastian,
what do you think, Sebastian? Come on.
I'm pretty much on the same page when it comes to the untrained status. I also did my calculations here in my little modeling, and I come out for Kipchoge somewhere in the ballpark of 154 for the 800, approximately. That goes with a VO2 max of 85, so really like best performance.
Okay.
Right? That's somewhere in this ballpark. Maybe 155, maybe 154, somewhere in that ballpark. With Bolt for the untrained, I have him significant slower. I see that like untrained. I think it's difficult to break 2 minutes for him. on the 800. I don't really see that, and that is based off a VO2 max of 52.5, so just in the middle of where you might think. And obviously, it gets a little bit better if he goes to a VO2 max of like 55. It buys him some seconds and so on and so forth, right? But that's about it. And I think he has the biggest gains to make by training. I think he can almost shave 10 seconds of the 800 meters.
I agree.
When we assume that he can bring up his VO2 max by maybe 10 milliliters, which is a lot if you think about total for his body weight, but with decent training, I mean, even though he's a sprinter, like, he should react pretty good to some higher intense intervals. And if you give him some time, I give him 10 milliliters more for trainability. And I don't see, because as Phil said, you are born as a sprinter. So I don't see Kipchoge ramping up his glycolytic system and creating phosphate a lot by training. There's not so much adaptation going on there. So he's kind of maxed out for me. But still, even if I give him, even if I give Bolt a VO2 max of like 65 by training, he loses by 2 seconds to Kipchoge.
So he closes the gap. Right?
Yeah, but now he's not going to beat him.
Now Bolt trains for a year. He's going to lose some body mass for sure, right? He's not going to go into this thing at 207. He's going to go into this thing at 188, maybe 190. A lean, mean fighting machine. Now I come from a sprinting background. I'm cheering for the sprinter. And two things you guys didn't talk about. Number one, Bolt has an incredible start, right? He's also has a lot of experience on the track doing track starts. There are some elements there that I think will help him potentially just with the comfort level. Even the fact of going to the track, doing a performance on the track. Now, I know that Kipchoge has won track events in the past, and he's got a lot of experience as well on the track. But from just a standpoint of shorter events, the pressure, the excitement, having to perform on the dot. A marathon, obviously you have to perform in the beginning, but there's still a little bit of leeway for kind of getting yourself up to speed. Okay, time out. We got a time out here. Sebastian, time out.
Are they time trialing or are they racing against each other?
Next to each other, the intimidation factor, the size, the hulking beast next to you.
Because if Bolt goes out too fast, but still manages, and Kipchoge is behind him, he's drafting him, and that's like running behind a house, right?
Oh, no, there's no drafting.
No chance. No chance.
No, that's a good point, though, man. Wow, you're right. I forgot about the draft. And it's 4-1 for Sebastian.
Here's the other thing, too, is that, I've got to see, Eliud's mindset up close. So before we went and did Breaking 2, we did a test event on the Monza track where we got everyone there and we ran them and we wanted to see how everyone would do. And the goal was we're just going to try and run just under 2-hour pace. We want to do about an hour for the, for the half marathon. And what you saw was Eliud ran, I think, at 59:17. Right, he was picking it up, right, because he wanted. I mean, on some level, he wanted to put his stamp on this, right. He's racing against Zerzane Tedesse, who is, he, at the time he held the half marathon world record, right. And so, Eliud kind of comes in there and just kind of, I think, psychologically wanted to say, you don't scare me, I got this. And so I don't imagine him being very intimidated by Bolt. I think he walks out there with that big smile on his face and just says, "I got your number, buddy, and let's see what happens."
Well, I think it was a great conversation. I think it would be an incredible experiment. I appreciate you guys giving us weighing in. We have 2 for Kipchoge. We have 3 for Kipchoge if they raced right now, and we have 2 against 1 for Kipchoge over Bolt if they were both trained up as much as they possibly could be for an 800 meter.
I'll tell you. I mean, knowing Eliud, you always want to see the guy win. My heart is with Kipchoge. I am a very, very, very poor endurance runner. I tried to run with those guys in Eldoret, and I lasted about 50 yards. It's no joke.
But before we close here, I just want to bring this back to cycling to some degree. I think one of the biggest challenges we all face when we work with different athletes is everybody kind of wants to do the thing that that they're not necessarily the greatest at, right? These endurance athletes want to try becoming a little bit of a better sprinter. And some of these sprinters always want to try to become a little bit better endurance, because if they make it to the end of these bigger races, they have less sprinters to deal with. And some of these endurance athletes, if they get in small little breakaway groups, like the World Championships and different events, they have to have enough kick to be able to win out of a small group. So I think one of those things, and one of the challenges for Kipchoge versus Bolt, if they ever did this, they could potentially ruin their careers if they train for the opposite energy systems. And you see it all the time in professional cycling, where these sprinters just get a little bit slower because they start adding all this volume, which helps them out. And then you see some of these other athletes that work a little bit too hard in their sprint, and they lose a little bit of that aerobic capacity. So talk about that balance and how difficult that balance is when you're working with sprinters and trying to get them to the finish of longer, harder races.
I mean, it's interesting when you look at the original, studies that were done looking at, you guys at VQ know all about it when we talk about critical power, right? Your sustainable power versus the W prime, this battery that contains your sprint capacity. And what you see is in most of those studies, when you increase critical power, the other has to go down, right? It's a mathematical certainty. Now, there have been studies that show you can maintain or increase your sprint ability, but those almost always come at the expense of dropping out your aerobic capacity. And for a cyclist, that could be catastrophic, right? If you're not there in the final the final 1,000 meters of that race, it's over for you.
What I think is important to talk about, Doc, though, is this is for people that are fairly trained. When you get athletes that are fairly new to the sport of cycling or not necessarily as trained up, they can increase that VO2 max at such a rate where both of those elements can improve.
Oh, absolutely. Especially early on in their careers. Like, you can lift the whole curve because they get stronger and they get more aerobic and all those kind of things. But once you're pretty fit, then it becomes more of a trade-off. That's absolutely right.
Now, Sebastian, you work with a lot of pro cycling teams, and I'm sure you're always playing that balancing game with some of these athletes. Talk about some of those conversations and how you manage to get them to be fast enough, or is that just one of these guessing games that there's really no perfect answer?
Well, obviously the idea is to not have it as a guessing game, right? And one of the most common mistakes, I think, in cyclists, and I'm having this conversation over and over again, I just said one last week, is that exactly what you say, a sprinter, like a road sprinter, so it's not a real sprinter anyway, right? It's the one-eyed in between the blinds when it comes to sprinting.
Right. I'm talking Bolt.
Right. And not talking a track sprinter, right? When they try to increase their aerobic capacity, performance, whatever you want to call that, what happens, exactly what you're saying, now you're not on the podium anymore in the sprint. In the sprint, you're maybe top 10 at its best. And what you want, on the other hand, is instead of, passing the KOM at position 120, you now pass it at 80. So you are like mediocre in kind of both events. And if you look at the sport of professional cycling and you look at the fastest sprinters, really dominated the biggest sprints, Kittel, Cavendish, Greipel, they don't care about, like, nobody's even talking about, nobody's asking the question, what position did they pass the KOM today, right? It's not important. So don't even try that. It is different when you come to guys like Wout van Aert or Mathieu van der Poel, or guys who go like in kind of the races like the classics, and they want to have some sprint capacity and some top end speed and some top end power, but they still have. And Wout van Aert last year was an excellent example how you can manage, how you can balance these things out, because like you saw him, he was riding on the top of the pack in the climbs, leading the jumbo train into the climbs, and still sprinting on the next day or the previous day. So, but it is a very, very fine line, and there are not many athletes that bring both, right? You either have like complete sprinters, and they don't even have VO2 max that brings them close to even finishing a stage, or you have these Kipchoge kind of guys, like highly endurance trained, but then obviously nothing is happening in the sprint. And it's very difficult to find those exceptional cyclists who can do, a little bit the best of both worlds.
And when you have an athlete, Peter Sagan is a great example of somebody that was able to do both of those things. But as his career carries on, and as Wout van Aert's career carries on, just from a standpoint of what you've seen in the lab, as well as what you've seen, in professional cycling, that speed tends to leave them a little bit as the years and years of aerobic work start to take hold. How would you keep Wout van Aert, Peter Sagan, these guys who still want to be competitive in these sprints and still want to have a chance at the green jersey? How do you maintain that balance and keep them fast? Or is it just like, I think you have to monitor that progress, and you have to kind of flag it before it's too late. So you have to flag, like we did the same, like, if you have some examples for Greipel, for example, where every season we had to pull like the stop sign onto the race program and really get them out of the racing and get them back into the gym and get them back into sprint training. Because also during the season, and this is how it starts, during the season, his sprinting power, sprint capacity, his glycolytic capacity would drop. And then just think about it, if this drops and then start of the next season, you don't bring it back to 100%, but only 95%. Each year you will lose a little bit. So it starts with monitoring it and starts with accepting, and that goes for everything, not only for sprinting, starts with accepting that what you did last year or 2 years ago, which worked successfully in training, might not work anymore as good, and you need to change because you have changed. So it also means that, maybe later in your career, you need to do more stuff in the gym or more sprinting. Like it's the beginning of a career, sprinting maybe came naturally. You were younger, you were faster, it's easier. But when you get older, you need to maybe, train for that, but before it came naturally to you.
And this is the thing, is that you need to be watching that data very, very closely as it's coming in on a day-to-day basis. Now for me, from my point of view, is I test athletes way more than I should, when there's something really important to watch. And athletes don't like that, right? I'm testing their critical power once a week. And the important thing, I'm testing way more commonly than that, because I want to catch it before it goes off the rails. Sebastian's exactly right. If you let the cow out of the barn, you're in big trouble.
And the bigger problem, I think, guys, and this happens to almost everybody, is when you get stronger, you can hold steady state power more. You can finish higher on the climbs. There's an addiction to that. There's an excitement about improving your lactic threshold or improving your FTP that everybody likes. But if they really analyzed how to be successful, especially in American racing or group rides or big events, it's your kick at the end that determines your place once you're strong enough to stay with the pack. So I think a lot of people are so focused on their FTP that it's really easy to lose the more critical component to success, which is some of that explosiveness. So I think, one of the takeaways that hopefully people are going to get from this is keep some gunpowder in your legs. And it's really easy to lose the gunpowder if you don't get to the gym, if you don't do the high intensity sprint work, if you don't do some of that glycolytic work, some of that creatine phosphate work, because that's a lot of times the difference between a top 3 result and a top 100 result. And I appreciate both of your time today, guys. It was awesome. I love the idea. What I'm going to try to do is mathematically model and get some animations around this race and show it to you guys. And hopefully we can kind of feed it in to this podcast. But any closing remarks here before we shut it down?
Good, Sebastian.
Thank you for this. Yeah, no, I can just comment on the thing you said last year, Robbie, with the FTP in the cycling race. In a cycling race, you never actually ride at your FTP, except for maybe partially in a climb or a long TT. But most people never ride at the FTP. And all these talks that we had today about the 800 meters in marathon and what Phil shared about breaking 2, I didn't hear the word FTP a lot as well. Right? There were other things that have been important. Totally agree to that.
Yeah, and it's funny, just to touch on the FTP thing, there's more and more literature coming out that it's really not a valid physiological threshold, in its own right. It tells you a little bit of information, but and it can be useful as kind of a rule of thumb, but in the real world, it doesn't necessarily do that. Whereas doing some of this other math, that anyone can do if they've got Excel, that gives you important information about how to, especially in running, about how to beat the people around you. People have often asked me, Skiba, like, you weren't an athlete. In fact, you're a terrible athlete. How did you coach all these like world champions? And it's literally because I've got Microsoft Excel and Google. So I go and I find out what these runners are capable of, and I make the model, and I say, yeah, your critical power is higher. You should start out fast and run their legs off. And then I look at you. Nope, you've got a better sprint capacity. Get in front of everyone, surge a couple times, and scare them so they think you're stronger than you are, and then wait for the sprint. And this is literally all it takes a lot of the time, especially in age group racing, and people just have to be a little sneaky,
For sure. I think at the end of the day, we all understand the importance of using your brain. And when it comes to performance training, it's such an important component to success, that's for sure. VO2 max and all these other things are important, but I'll take the guy who's a racer at heart and who can maximize all these other elements over the guy with the highest VO2 max, that's for sure. But in closing, it was great to speak with both of you. If you want to catch our Breaking Up with FTP, look back at one of our old podcasts that Sebastian and I have done. That was a good one. Again, it surfaces again today, the importance or the not importance of FTP. But I really appreciate your time. I love this thought of Kipchoge versus Bolt. I think the information, the math was great. The learnings were great. And I really appreciate you guys continuing to teach me as well as being guests here on the Velocity Podcast. So thank you.
Thanks, Robbie. Good to see you. Take care, Sebastian.
Thank you.